I'm here at the University of Minnesota exploring the soul of Western civilization. The DNA of the Western civilization was written in the universities and monasteries in Europe. Now, the universities have rejected the ideas that created the modern West. Therefore, in a series of lectures, I'm exploring if the sun must now set on the West. Britney Spears' Blackout album is #1 in the charts this week. So why are we talking about Paris Hilton? That's because last week I was traveling with Mr. Gajendra Patel. We were driving to Sioux Center, Iowa, and stopped at Worthington for dinner. And just as we were walking out of the restaurant, with corner of my eye, I had a glimpse of a 10-second news item, something to the effect that Paris Hilton was planning a trip to Rwanda. As I was stepping out of the restaurant, I said to myself, I hope she's going with Rick Warren and find some purpose for her life. And I forgot all about it, but when I woke up in the morning, I found myself praying for her. I didn't mean to be mocking her in any sense. I really was praying for her. And then I began feeling guilty that why am I mocking her? Maybe she is sincere. Maybe with all that has happened to her during the last several months, she is seeking something true, something genuine, something worthwhile to live for, and this is to be commended and supported and appreciated. So I began to analyze my attitude, that why did I feel the way I did, my first reaction to her. And that got me going. So it's not so much about her because I don't really know her and can't judge her, but about my perception of Hollywood scene that I was struggling with. And what does Paris Hilton have to do with Paul? She is an icon, and it is legitimate to think about her because we are here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. When Minnesota chose to have St. Paul as its capital, it affirmed that Paul was a very significant icon for Western civilization. He helped shape the world in which you live, the world in which she is born, and she is grown up. Perhaps she wouldn't be what she is if she was in a Muslim country or in some other traditional culture. The West has moved from St. Paul to Paris Hilton, and comparing or looking at that whole transition, what has happened, is the purpose of this evening. There is a deeper sense in which the two connect. The word charismatic has been totally secularized. St. Paul is the originator of the term charisma or charismatic, the gifts of the Spirit. And Paris Hilton symbolizes the people who would be seen as charismatic today. That they have the charisma, they have the following. There are millions of people who are interested in her, millions of young women who would like to imitate her. So what has happened to this term and the concept of charisma? Now, of course, what the two of them, Paul and Paris Hilton, share in common is that both of them went to jail, though for very different reasons. think about Paris Hilton saying that she wants to go to Rwanda to do something for the poor, to become a model, she says, for the younger generation. Her involvement with the poor has a beginning. As you might recall, her first television series was The Simple Life. And just before the series premiered on television, her pornographic film, One Night in Paris, which was a home sex video made with her and her boyfriend, that was released and became the #1 selling pornographic video. Both of them sued each other. She was responsible for the release of that video. She was awarded $400,000. And to cover up all the negative media that she had received, she decided that she would donate that $400,000 for some charity, maybe for sexually abused women, etc. That's where her service to the poor began. Many skeptics would obviously say that that was a good ploy to take care of the Texas. But be that as it may, this was another thing that she shares in common with Paul. Both had a passion for the poor, or both tried to serve those in need, whatever the conflicting motives that they might have and the styles that they might have. So, having argued that the topic from Paul to Paris Hilton is a legitimate topic, obviously my main reason for phrasing the issue in those words is because we are exploring if the sun is setting in the west, if there is a decline happening which is visible, and if the trend continues, where does that take Western civilization? That's the issue. Now, if I may ask for forgiveness, that instead of comparing Paul with Paris Hilton, I'd like to begin comparing my wife with Paris Hilton. It's getting worse. The reason is I got interested in her because she wants to go to Africa to serve the poor. And many years ago, my wife made a similar decision to come with me to serve the poor. And the two decisions might help you understand the two concepts of heroism. And obviously, I'm biased. I see my wife as my hero. This began in 1982. I was given a 2-month study leave to go to Europe to study to complete my book, Truth and Social Reform, and also to give lectures in different countries where friends had been asking me to come and speak based on our experience of our work with the poor. The day we took off, 2-3 men got into my father's house who had taken early retirement and had come and was living just about 5 kilometers from us to help us administratively with our growing work. Our work was growing rapidly. At its peak, we had about 1,000 people working with us in transforming local communities. We were digging wells, deepening roads, running schools, different kinds of things. And because I'm not a good administrator, my father had come to help. And these men got into his home. He was living on his own farm. We were living in a community owned by our nonprofit organization. These men tied him up, beat up his wife, my stepmother, raped a young woman who was living there, and then they took out a knife and threatened to gouge out his eyes unless he would promise to empty out his bank account and give them everything, which he did the following day. And after that, he went to the police. But the police wouldn't register a case against anyone. He found that very strange, and he began to suspect that this was not just a case of robbery, But these number of politicians who hated what I was doing and wanted to persecute me, had been threatening me with to take my life, etc., that they were really behind this, and that's why the police was not registering this case. So it became impossible for my dad to keep living on this isolated farm. So he moved to the city, to a guest house, which was just a few minutes, 2 minutes walk from his cousin, who was a physician, a retired physician. So he was hoping that he will find some comfort and support in that community where he had old friends and his cousins, and in fact, his real sister was also there. But within 2 or 3 days of his moving there, one night some men got into his cousin's home, stabbed her with multiple stabs, killed her and her husband, and took whatever property they could and ran off. This obviously shook him. Just a few days later, 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock at the door of one of our Muslim volunteers. There were 2 volunteers. We were distributing seed in an area of where there had been a famine. One volunteer was sleeping in one house, and another one was sleeping in another house. So this Muslim volunteer opened the door, and 2 men started hitting him with axes. He picked up a stool, tried to defend himself, and couldn't defend himself. They left him for dead, took away his bicycle and whatever little belongings he had. So a series of things happening like this, one after the other, really shook up my father, the chairman of our board, and our board members. And they all became convinced that the attempts were directed really against me and against the work that we were doing. There were these powerful people who wanted to chase us away. So the criminals, politicians, and the police, and the bureaucracy, they were acting together in all of this. The criminals were really the front men. So our board decided that I should not come back to the village because I will definitely be killed if I go back. But my father knew that I'm crazy and I'm likely not to listen to the board. So they said that even if Vishal insists on coming back, Ruth and our 2 girls, they should certainly not come back because Ruth will be kidnapped and raped. And so 3 young men were sent to prevent us from returning. We landed in Delhi, and these men received us at the airport and began to tell all these horror stories to build an argument why we should not come back. Well, I was not convinced that there was real hard evidence that there was a human conspiracy against me. I said that, well, there is a conspiracy, but to me at this moment it looks more like a conspiracy in the heavenlies, demonic, satanic conspiracy. And if so, we do have spiritual resources in prayer and faith to fight this battle, and I'm not going to be deterred. But obviously there is a possibility that these things have been planned by some powerful politicians who were criminals and are friends of criminals. But all the information that you have given to me doesn't convince me that it is. I don't have the guns and the physical resources to cope with these criminals and the policemen and the politicians, but I certainly have the resources to cope with spiritual forces of darkness and wickedness. But I'm not going to influence my wife's decision, because her decision is not just about herself, but also regarding our 2 daughters. So she must decide for herself whether or not she wants to come back to this dangerous situation. So Ruth decided to take a night and pray. Next morning, after reflecting, meditating, reading the Bible and praying, she's just made her decision out loud that there is no point in following the Lord half-heartedly if we're going to follow him, we might as well follow him all the way. If this means death, so be it, but I will not turn back. Now, that obviously was a heroic decision on her part. And the amazing thing was that within a minute or two of her making that decision, the telephone rang. There was an Australian girl on the line, Liz Brattle, who had been in India as a missionary with Interserve and was working with Bruce Nichols. Some of you might have heard his name. And in that capacity, she had typed my first book, The World of Gurus. I handwrote it, Ruth had it and typed it, and Liz retyped it professionally. This was 76, she had done that. In 82, she came back totally without any communication with us. She just came back. She had decided to work with us as my secretary. So she called up, and Ruth picked up the phone and said, "This is Liz. I've come from Australia to work with you guys, but my board isn't going to let me go if you are not going back to the village, and I'm told that you're not going back to the village because your board has decided so." Ruth said, "Actually, I just decided that I am going back to the village." So I not only had Ruth now, I had Liz. As soon as Ruth hung up the phone rang up again, and this time it was a girl from Wheaton, Illinois, Kay Coudart, saying, "Hey, you guys don't know me, but I've just come from Wheaton College to work with you because you people don't have phones or anything in your village. I didn't bother communicating with you. My advisor just said that your community welcomes everybody, so I've come to work with you. But I'm hearing that Ruth isn't going, therefore my advisor isn't going to let me go if Ruth isn't going, so I'm just calling to find out if Ruth is going to the village." And Ruth said, "Well, I just decided that I am going, and in fact there is another Australian young woman who has come to go with us." So I returned not only with my wife, but 2 other Western young women and 2 daughters, and the whole area was stunned that this guy is really crazy, or he has some secret weapons. Now, you can see that here was not just one woman, my wife, but an American young woman, an Australian young woman, who heard all the horror stories, who heard the wisdom of the board, including my dad, who were there on the ground, that this is absolutely foolish thing for us to go there, for these women to go there to serve the poor, because they will be kidnapped, they will be raped, they might be murdered, and yet they decide that they are going to do it. That's traditional heroism, which was inspired by their faith. They believed some things. They believed that there was a living God who was more than able to take care of them. And even if he didn't take care of them, he was worth it for us to lay down our lives for him. He's worthy because he first laid down his life for us on the cross. This was heroism inspired by the cross. Now, my initial reaction towards Paris Hilton was that this Hollywood heroism came across as so superficial, that here is a mighty celebrity. The media, everybody would just follow her, and I have no doubt that if she does go to Rwanda next year, President Bill Clinton is going to invite her to Clinton Initiative annual event. And she will soon be partying, not just with those young people at 2 o'clock at night, but she would be partying with heads of states if she begins serving the poor the way she proposes to do. But what is happening here is that charisma has been reduced to what Philip Reef says, sociologists, charisma in a can. You need a new hairstyle because the old hairstyle isn't good enough. You can spray on some charisma. Here is a mighty woman from today's standards who now needs some destitutes in Africa to save her image. Right? She may not, I hope she doesn't, but this was my first interpretation of the news, that how desperate that this poor thing needs some destitutes out there to save her image that she has ruined. Can they really save her? Or is she taking her lostness to them? Will she be destroying them? You know, what service is she going to render? Distribute condoms? Or birth control pills? Save them from HIV/AIDS? She can't possibly teach abstinence. There is nothing inside. Why has the West made this move from St. Paul to Paris Hilton? Well, Philip Reeve blames Max Weber, the sociologist, for beginning to secularize the notion of the charisma, making it something which used to be internal, the gift of faith, the fruit of faith that my wife and this American girl and the Australian girl reflected, the inner beauty, the inner strength, that inner life no longer makes sense in a material world which has no place for God, no place for spirit. You are not a spiritual being, as we considered earlier. There is no soul, there is no spirit. Soul has been amputated. Then what is driving you? Marx says that it is economics, economy, money, that is shaping everything, that determines everything. Paris Hilton might say that, yes, I'm going to Africa because otherwise I have to give taxes. This gives me tax-deductible receipts. So yes, even my charity is in fact driven by money. Freud says that it's sex that drives everything. And Paris Hilton might say that, yes, I am a sexual animal and that is important to me. What's your problem? Nietzsche said that it is will to power that drives. And she says, look, I do have a lot of fan club, but now United Nations will become my fan if I start donating like Angelina Jolie. So I will have real power. So yes, it is in fact will to power. Everybody is seeking power. What's your problem if I get a little bit too? It's these external factors that drive. There is no inner beauty, inner depth, inner conviction, faith, creed. There is no charisma without creed. What is inspiring my wife in that story is her faith. This was how the West began. If you look at St. Paul, there are dramatic moments in his life. You know, he does begin as a classical hero. The classical heroism, Greco-Roman heroism, was about power. It was one's ability to defeat others, subdue others, force others to fall before you, fall in line. So if we leave the epics aside, in real history, Alexander the Great would be iconic hero of the Greek world. He is trained to be a philosopher king. He becomes a ruthless tyrant who leaves Macedonia, goes all the way to India, conquering the world, subduing people under his feet. So hero is a strong man, a great man who can subdue people under his feet. In the Roman world, Augustus Caesar would be an icon who extends the kingdom of Rome all the way from England to the Middle East. So a hero, a charismatic figure, is a powerful figure who can conquer others and rule over others. Now, this world which worshipped power was the world in which this little baby was born in Bethlehem in a manger, powerless, helpless, poor. And he died on the cross, mocked, insulted, humiliated, shamed, nailed, stripped. Something amazing happened, that in that classical world which worshipped power, this defeated Messiah began to be worshipped as the Almighty God, the creator and sustainer of this universe. It was an amazing transformation. Paul began his life with an understanding of heroism which was shaped by his Greco-Roman classical culture, where he is obtaining power, letters of authority from high priests and others, and going and persecuting followers of the way, followers of the cross. He's killing them, stoning them, imprisoning them. But then, as he is going to Damascus, he has an amazing experience. This Jesus, who had been crucified in shame, meets with him because he is risen and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you? I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Saul falls on his face. He spends 3 days fasting and praying. He is blind, but he sees God. And he has a vision that someone has come, Ananias has come, laid hands on him, and he's received sight. Jesus gives vision to this elderly saint, go, lay hands on this young man, pray for him. And he says, well, this man has come here, he's been killing and imprisoning your followers, and now he has come to Damascus to persecute us. You want me to go? Jesus says, yes, you go. Well, Saul is converted, he becomes Paul, and he begins to go around the world to preach this crucified, defeated Messiah as the Lord, that all authority in heaven and on earth is given to him. Every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess that he is the Lord. I've seen him, and he is the one who is empowering me. Now, Paul is not seeking power. He is, in fact, courting arrest. Towards the end of his life, he is on his way to Jerusalem. A prophet, Agabus, comes, picks up his belt and ties himself and says that the Holy Spirit says that the person to whom this belt belongs will be tied in Jerusalem and arrested and imprisoned. All the believers begin to say to Paul, please don't go. You know this man is a prophet. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, he had predicted a famine which came, and you started your famine relief. This man really is a prophet. Listen to him. But Paul says, I'm not only willing to be arrested in Jerusalem, I'm willing to die. So he goes. He is arrested. And there are powerful scenes. The centurion has barely succeeded in saving Paul from being lynched by the mob. They'll tear him apart. This Roman officers fear. But Paul wants to go back to the crowd to speak to them and to speak to them about Jesus. He's really courting persecution everywhere he goes. He's being stoned, thrown in prison, and he is being perceived as someone who's turning the world upside down. So he redefines heroism as something which is internal, a power which comes from inside and is not intimidated with fear of death and persecution and beatings and imprisonment, but goes out to serve God and serve people because he knows the truth. He's seen the risen Lord. He has a faith that has changed him, and this faith overcomes the world. This was the heroism of Christ manifested by Paul. Then the church became an institution where charisma, the gift of the Spirit, the gift of grace, was replaced by rituals and power, administrative, political, ecclesiastical power, and corruption came in. At the Reformation, which began to create the modern world, as we have seen in people like Martin Luther and Tyndale, who was strangled and burnt at stake for translating the New Testament into English, what they discover is this inner power, the power of faith. Their commitment to truth allows them to stand up against power, against corruption, and what they are seeking is truth. What they are seeking is obedience to truth, obedience of faith, being faithful to God, even if this means death. And then power is released through them. This is power of the Spirit, which is what Paul called charisma, the power of the Spirit, where people have no organizational power, financial power, or political power, or the power of the sword, but power of the Spirit, gift of the Spirit, fruit of the Spirit, which begins to change the world. What has happened in between, from Paul to Luther or Tyndale, let's say, the Roman world becomes Christian, at least nominally. Most people are illiterate. Printing doesn't exist. Bible isn't available. They don't really know true Christianity. So there's a lot of superstition, a lot of nominal Christianity, which is really paganism, baptizes Christianity. But the church does try to bring classical heroism, which exalted physical power, skill in arms, use of force, under the moral authority of the church. Medieval heroism is chivalry. It is still physical power, skill in arms, but some other values are added to it, like loyalty, generosity, etc. They become part of chivalry. But there is private warfare. The knights are killing each other, and some of this private warfare is institutionalized as tournaments, which are huge festivals where knights are fighting, and if you win, you kill the other guy or keep him, hold him captive for ransom. You always take his horse and money and swords. And what is a hero seeking? He's seeking glory, to be celebrated in poetry, in songs, in stories. He's seeking money, and he's seeking women. That's what a medieval hero is seeking, and they're Christians. The church begins to critique it. Thomas Aquinas writes against that these people who are seeking glory with the use of sword and spear and lances, etc., they are seeking vainglory. They are actually guilty of homicide. So the church begins to pass resolutions that, first of all, there should be no private warfare from Saturday evening to Monday morning. So Sabbath is to be kept holy. Then it's extended, okay, from Wednesday night to Monday morning, there will be no private warfare. If you die at that time, the church is not going to give you a burial. So you excommunicated here, and you forfeit heaven it's also. And then the church adds that during the season of Advent, during the season of Lent, Christmas and Easter, there will be no warfare allowed of this kind. And these knights were a nuisance during the Middle Ages because they were under no authority. The state had crumbled. The church was trying to bring them under authority. First, these movements like the peace of God, the truce of God, which began in the 11th century. And then the idea of the Christian knight, where the knight would fast and pray and keep his weapons at the altar whole night, and then in the morning will have a ritual bath, and then take vows to use his force to defend the church, defend the monks and priests and women. Then he would wear these. Then church becomes a little more creative and tries to get rid of these knights who are seeking glory. Okay, you are seeking glory, you go to Jerusalem, liberate it from the infidel, launch crusades, and die there to be immortalized in songs, leave us alone. So they're sent over there. But it doesn't work. By the 14th century, as people begin to read more and more the Bible, they begin to realize that real heroism is an internal thing. Christ is our hero. We are worshiping him on the cross. We are meditating on the cross. We are singing about the cross. What is the heroism of the cross that conquered the classical world? This becomes an issue. A little before the Reformation, when in Holland this book, Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis is published, people begin to realize that the medieval church has this concept of Christian knights, but it is essentially irreconcilable with biblical Christianity, because the knights have to have noble birth. They have to be skillful with weapons and use of force, and they're seeking personal glory. This is not what Christianity is all about. So that idea begins to be rejected, particularly with Erasmus's book on peace. And then with Luther, the idea is completely rejected, and you have a new kind of a hero, the charismatic hero, whose power comes from the power of the Spirit, which begins to be recovered. So Luther really becomes the source of the renewal of the idea of charisma, because real power is from inside. So his heroism begins in 1520. He is asked, the emperor is inviting you to come and face the trial of heresy. Would you go? And he says, yes, if emperor calls, I will go, even if I'm too sick to stand on my feet, because it might mean death, but if what we believe is truth, we have to seal our witness with our blood. So I will go, which he does in 1522, and is judged as a heretic. So this is a new kind of a hero, which is Hebrews 2, where Jesus became flesh and died to free those who have lived in slavery of Satan because of fear of death. Satan has been ruling because of fear of death, but the knowledge of death and resurrection of Christ sets us free from that fear, and we live by faith, and faith overcomes the world. So this new understanding of heroism is recovered, not that there were no such heroes during the Middle Ages, but becomes a mass movement with Luther and begins to change the world. Now, I think the classic statement is in John Milton's Paradise Lost. When paradise is lost, Satan has won. So Lucifer is the hero of Paradise Lost. And Lucifer makes this classic statement that it is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. To rule is better, right? Even if it means going to hell or turning this world into a hell. I'd rather be a ruler than be a servant. What Milton is saying is that this classical and medieval heroism is really diabolical, a Luciferian heroism. The heroism of the cross is where the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, stands up from the dining table, disrobes himself, puts on the towel of a servant, takes a basin of water and starts washing the feet of his disciples. And he says that I have brought in a new kingdom. Whoever wants to be great in this kingdom must become a servant to the others. This is transformation. So he has started a revolution where power is redefined, leadership is redefined as service, as ministry. Once the Bible begins to spread, this revolution takes off, then it has huge political consequences. In England, the kings begin to lose their power, and servants begin to increase their power to the point that the first servant becomes the most important office. And that's what prime minister literally means, first minister, first servant. And he rules not with a battalion of soldiers, but with a battalion of civil servants. Because the state exists for individuals. If Jesus died for them, I cannot possibly dominate them, suppress them. This is the political revolution where leadership is redefined as servanthood that begins to bring this internal faith, knowledge of truth that He is the Lord. What am I? I'm servant. A new kind of a hero who would serve others to the point of laying down his life, not writing checks that save taxes, but laying down one's life to serve others, the kind of heroism I illustrated with these three young women, including my wife. That was the heroism of the cross, which really became the heroism of the West. So much so that even though Hollywood is heathen now, it has to produce entertainment, works of entertainment, for a culture shaped by the cross. So movies like Alexander the Great or Troy, they don't do well because they are reflecting classical understanding of heroism, which just doesn't make sense. The other day, one lady in Sioux Center, she was saying, "Oh, I watched Troy last night. It didn't make any sense. They're fighting senselessly." It's not senseless. That is will to power. That is what heroism in the West was. Now it doesn't make any sense because heroism has been redefined by the cross of Jesus Christ. So you might have Star Trek, which is a totally secular humanist series, but think of a movie like The Wrath of Khan. Spock has died. You know, there was a nuclear leak in spaceship Enterprise. Spock got out to fix the leak and was contaminated and died. And so he's put in this black case and is being shuttled to his grave in space. And Captain Kirk gives a speech. And that's the only time in Star Trek where a Christian hymn is being played on piano. Amazing Grace is being played. And he gives a speech. Spock is a real hero because one died for many. That's heroism. Not killing others, but giving your life to save many. And that justifies resurrection. The ending of that story, Wrath of Khan, is interesting. The end, the capsule is in Northern California, in Edenic-looking place, and there is light blinking on that case where his body is, and Spock's voice comes out the only time in the whole series and says, "These are the journeys of," how does it go? "To go boldly where no man has gone before," suggesting that this kind of heroic death actually brings resurrection. That modern West was created by an understanding of heroism which came from the cross, demonstrated by Apostle Paul and explained by Paul in his epistles, which began to shape the West. And people like Tyndale really discovered the Bible and began reading and obeying the Bible. They became heroes, where powerless individuals with no power except the power of the Holy Spirit in them stood up against mighty governments and emperors and created the Western civilization. Cross and resurrection are not part of Christian worldview. They are eyewitness statements. They are historical facts which have to have a bearing on our philosophical interpretation of reality, of soul, of spirituality, etc. But the gospel is eyewitness account. It's not a worldview. It shapes our worldview, but it's truth. It happened in history. And Christian faith is not primarily a philosophical idea, although it is a whole worldview, but it is anchored in what God has done in human history. And that is what we need to recover. Then your faith is anchored not in philosophical ideas, but on the rock, on truth. Then you can lay down your life for it. That's what really inspired people like Tyndale. But the people that we've talked about, Nietzsche and Freud and Max Weber and Karl Marx, began the process of secularization. The spirit disappeared, only externals remain. So now even charisma comes in cans, which in Hollywood you have philanthropic advisors who advise these stars how to launder money. That's what Hollywood's philanthropy is, money laundering. That is where heroism has been reduced to. Greatness is this external makeover. Now, one hopes that this is not what Paris Hilton is doing. And we certainly would pray that she would discover truth, she would discover substance, and that she would not be this superficial person that we have seen on screen. But the reality is that as the West has amputated its soul, it is becoming superficial, empty, repulsive. The point of today's lecture is that I have to know the truth, and then the truth will set me free, including from my culture. And it will empower me to take on my culture and change it, hopefully towards what is good, beautiful, and true. So it's not about me, but it's about my obedience to truth. That is true heroism. Heroism is a matter of weight and substance, inner power, not cosmetic appearance. So I'm going to Africa because I really want to give myself to serve the poor, not because I want to improve my image, which was ruined by my partying and drunk driving and imprisonment. Paul goes to jail, Paris Hilton goes to jail, but for very different reasons. And we have to choose where we belong. Secularization has destroyed the soul of the West and made the contemporary Western civilization empty and repulsive. I did unfortunately focus exclusively on Hollywood, but that's what political hero has become. Political hero in the West is superficial, empty, a man without content. His charisma is as blank as Paris Hilton. That's where sports hero, that's what they have become. You don't have chariots of fire. you don't have men and women of substance. They take substance, they're addicted to substance abuse, but there's no inner substance there. This problem is much bigger and deeper because it's a cultural problem. And Paris Hilton just became my victim simply because of alliteration with Paul to Paris made sense. The West has moved from St. Paul to Paris Hilton, where it can no longer command respect from the world. And it's just a matter of time when this will to power takes the West back to those classical heroes who would derive their sense of power by lording it over others, by crushing others rather than serving others. Thank you very much. These lively interactions with students, faculty, and community at the University of Minnesota have reinforced my faith that there is no reason for the West to amputate its own soul. A recovery of faith is possible and desirable. The sun need not set on the West.